Far Cry as a series has always been about arriving at a location, often tropical, learning of said location's local politics, and toppling whatever the oppressive force is there, often with a hint of the supernatural, whether by way of a Tatau or a vague curse upon the land that causes its inhabitants to change. This change in the player character, often used as a means of critiquing the player, is postured as a regression. We enter a state where we kill and loot like uncivilized beasts, using the world and the societies around it like a playground. After the success of Far Cry 3, many were concerned that Ubisoft would fall into a formula, and those concerns were heightened when Far Cry 4's biggest criticism was that it was too similar to its critically acclaimed predecessor. Far Cry Primal is Ubisoft's answer, and an answer that says, fine, we'll do something different. Is that answer a good one though? Well, if there's one thing I've been told, it's that Far Cry Primal is underrated. Let's first discuss the ultimate subjectivity of that statement, because what does it even mean? If a game sold well and reviewed well, but someone thinks it should have been given even better treatment, then by all means, it's underrated to them. So I can't answer if I think it's underrated, and so instead, I want to focus on looking at why people feel the way they do about Primal. I'll still try to answer the underrated and overrated question, but my goal here is to see what Primal does right, wrong, if I feel it deserved its sales and review scores, and how it stacks up against the rest of the series. As the name might imply, Primal takes place during, in layman's terms, caveman ooga booga times, more specifically the later Stone Ages. Primal was praised heavily for being historically accurate, which if you've played any of the Assassin's Creed games, then you'll know that this isn't a surprise, but it's impressive regardless, and showcases a common theme with Ubisoft's older and even current releases, which is their worlds. Primal presents a world that may as well be fantasy with how gorgeous it looks, making me nearly yearn for the nature-led past. But that doesn't mean we want our mechanics to regress too. Primal, rather appropriately I guess, presents Far Cry at its most bare bones, which leads to some great moments and does open the door for innovation regarding those baseline systems, but no revolutionary changes make it through that door, instead only peeking their head inside to check the place out. Where Primal shines most is in retrospect, as it's one of the last major prehistoric video games we received in the last decade. During the 90s, we saw plenty of caveman-centric games, but that gimmick has since subsided, meaning Primal is still to this day undeniably unique, and occupies a niche that is still relatively untapped. But why is that? I'll try to answer that, but more importantly, I want to see why Far Cry Primal has such a die-hard fanbase, and why the game still holds up all these years later. And I'll spoil it now, it's not necessarily because of its setting being a commodity. Far Cry Primal has some great ideas, but it does also have flaws. And while it looks exactly like any other Far Cry game, it is entirely different for not the best reasons. Be prepared for spoilers, though I'm sure you can imagine the story is a lot of unga bunga and mammoth riding. Because this is Far Cry Primal, 12,000 years later. Oros is a new land to our main character Takar, as he searches for his fellow Winja people, but it may not be entirely new to the player. Some noted about a week after the game launched that it shared similarities with Far Cry 4's Kyrat, specifically with rivers and general topography. This is a little ironic, given that the idea for Primal originated after Far Cry 3, but just wasn't executed until after Far Cry 4. When questioned about the map, Ubisoft was by no means shy, and while on the surface this appears like a lazy repurposing, I think it's actually an idea that works in favor of the game and its historical themes. To immediately defend the use of the map, I think it's absolutely fine as long as it doesn't feel reused. And to me, I felt that not only was it entirely separate from Kyrat, but it also looked better at almost every angle. Elden Ring, a game praised for its environments, reused assets, hell, even bosses all throughout the game. Murkwater Cave's boss arena is the exact same as the boss arena in the Sage's Cave. Does it matter? No, because chances are you never noticed. If it seems like I'm making excuses for the game, then let's go further and check out the minimap, which is constantly showing roads where there are none and generally being inaccurate and unhelpful. This made me see the map in a different light, as if perhaps in this prehistoric age, maps weren't very good and thus had plenty of inaccuracies, or this map is representative of what the land will eventually become, as if eventually roads will be built there. The problem with this interpretation is that this land is not Kyrat. Kyrat is somewhere near the Himalayas, whereas Oros is meant to be somewhere in Central Europe. Meaning this connection likely wasn't intentional and that, yeah, I guess I am looking at a shitty minimap and gleaning that the devs were geniuses. Kidding aside, the minimap was a constant frustration because it really doesn't show that much aside from where plants and enemies are, which is valuable, but not at all necessary. Oros is a land full of eye candy, so get this fucking eyesore out of the way! A compass might have been better suited, or better yet, just let us figure it out. This isn't the end of the UI issues, and while I think it's not a big deal, what is are the markers that appear when you get close to a mission. location. Remember, this world is beautiful, and we'll talk more about it soon, but it would be a hell of a lot easier to appreciate it if I could see it. Instead, whenever close to an objective, I have to stare at a massive JPEG of some caveman's compressed-ass face card. Minor criticism? Yes, but this game made me realize how much UI matters in games. I know I'm a tad late to the party, but especially when a game can look as good as this, man, let me see it! Oros reminded me a lot of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, not in the sense that it was bloated, but in the way that it felt so otherworldly. There are no sci-fi elements here, at least not entirely, but the game does take some creative liberties when it comes to the world to make it more picturesque. Yeah, maybe the god rays are a little much if we're looking purely at realism, but if a view like this isn't realistic, then I don't want realism. The views from practically every outpost are pure eye candy, and the night sky illuminated by stars and nebula-like dust sells the beauty even more and romanticizes the past. In our modern times, stars aren't always visible. First world problems, I know, but in Vancouver, with so much light pollution, we don't see the stars often. Now, I'm not saying I want to go back to the caveman times, okay? I consider myself accustomed to not sleeping in the dirt and wiping my ass with tree leaves, but it did make me think, wow. The past must have been beautiful. This extends to the fauna too, as animals control most of the land, not showing hostility all the time, but dictating how we move and when we move. Wolves hunt in packs, offering a challenge for the early game, but will also hunt other animals. So like any good escape, running into an animal that's slower than you will offer room to breathe as the wolves shift their attention. As the old saying goes, you don't have to be the fastest, just not the slowest. Cutscenes in this game share the beauty of the open world, and actually even more so. The lighting when inside huts was genuinely jaw-dropping, and the faces here absolutely cleared the modern Ubisoft releases. It's incredible to me how great their facial animation and structure was. Like, what happened, guys? Hell, these faces are often so expressive that they border on showing off. Each character has large eyes, no doubt an excuse to show off how good they look, and again, the expressiveness of their faces and the way they get so close to you makes it clear that Ubisoft knows these faces look killer too. When comparing this to other Far Cry games, the first thing that comes to mind is the themes. When looking at Far Cry 2, 3, and 4, there was a clear theme of entering a relatively foreign land, being out of your depth, and having to conquer that land. Each land, respectively, had someone who represented both the political themes of the location and story, while our journey represented the strength required to conquer that location and whoever sat on its throne. Much of this was in service of critiquing the player. If you want to know more about that, I expand upon it in my videos on those games, but my concern going into Primal was not if there would still be a land for us to conquer. In fact, in that regard, the game is as on the nose as ever. But the concern was, what critiques will the game levy against us? Does it even need to? Primal is, given the lack of a number in the title, a spin-off. So maybe I shouldn't be expecting the game to give us that critique. And with that in mind, let's look at the journey of conquering Oros. Oros sees us fighting some human adversaries, but who sits on the throne of Oros is not the people, but the wildlife. As mentioned with the wolves, the animals dictate how you move, when you move, and so much more. Torches will scare away some animals, so keeping one handy will aid in keeping you safe. But that light source will attract more animals, especially at night, and it makes stealth near impossible. During the daytime, you have more safety as animals are less aggressive, and visibility is much better. Each animal acts as its own roadblock. If you hear a leopard, then you need to analyze your environment for high ground, because it's too fast and too lethal to tackle head on. Herds of mammoths are often friendly, just as long as you don't get too close, and traversing the world always had intention, even more so than previous entries, and led to memorable moments. I had one where a pack of wolves was surrounding me and my solution was to jump on a log and poke them with a spear. It was a great memory. Your upgrades, village, and resources are all tied to crafting, much more so than the previous games, making Primal a game where you have the strongest connection to the land. I had mentioned in my previous videos I often ignored the hunting and gathering in Far Cry for two major reasons. The first, hunting was rather boring, and even the scariest creatures got turned into Swiss cheese in just a few seconds. The second, I only ever did it as a means to an end, i.e. to get an upgrade. Bullets could be purchased, syringes could be found, and weren't needed. And with the ability to pick up enemy weapons, I never needed to prepare much for an encounter. Primal forces the player to rely on hunting and gathering as a means of progression still, but also as a means of survival. Every weapon has durability, meaning you'll constantly be needing to craft new weapons, and everything you do in the game costs some kind of resource. They almost go in an interesting direction with this in regards to healing, but seem a little too scared to change up the formula. Healing is now primarily done by consuming animal fat, obtained primarily through hunting animals. This encourages players to focus on hunting as they go, which not only fulfills the caveman fantasy, but also keeps the game more balanced. I've mentioned before that Far Cry games can be quite easy, and Primal is actually one of the more difficult games, and this is one of the reasons why. When you can't continually pop your arm back into place to heal, you become much more in touch with the land and thus further the caveman fantasy while also furthering your personal journey of conquering said land by way of better understanding the creatures that call it home. However, they still include something called a primitive heal, which is the familiar healing from the other games. I don't think this is a massive blow to balance, especially when consuming animal fat will always replenish more health than primitive healing, and will do so in less time, but more encouragement would have been nice because unlike other Far Cry games, preparation is highlighted much more. Some of the endgame challenges will require genuine thought, and cannot be brute forced entirely. However, upgrading your weapons does eventually lead you to slaughtering the wildlife without thinking about it. Ironically, the stronger you get, the less you engage with the mechanics. Early on, strategy is needed to take down mammoths, and even a dole could be a pain, but by the end, they'll be getting brutally bonked with whatever club you have. Leopards are now a minor inconvenience when they were once a death sentence. I don't think this is a problem necessarily, because it only happened once I had completed nearly all side content, and if this kind of power is a reward for conquering the game's challenges, then it's probably fine, but the humor of it can't be forgotten. Speaking of humor, nature in this game can be really funny. Sometimes enemies can be blown away by the impact of a spear, and sometimes I would see an eagle pick up a small animal only to drop them to their death. Brutal, but absolutely hilarious when contrasted with how serious the game's beauty is. But after all of this beauty, all of this nature, at the end of the day, this is still a Far Cry game, and you'd be damned if you thought Ubisoft would let you forget it. Primal, as you might imagine, feels familiar in a lot of ways, and it's not just the reused animations or similar engine, but it's that a lot of what you did over 12,000 years ago is the exact same as it is in the present. An outpost in Far Cry 3 saw you approaching an area, scoping it out, planning a strategy to try and sweep the base without being spotted or raising any alarms. The problem by now is that I just accurately described the outpost in Far Cry 4 and Primal 2. In fairness, this might not be a problem as much as it is a trend in the series, so for the sake of charitability, let's look at the larger mechanics that make these outposts different. The first being that they aren't all outposts. Bonfires around the map are like diet outposts, consisting of fewer enemies, and I found these were much better for keeping up the pace when pursuing the campaign, as it wouldn't ever take more than a minute to make a pit stop, and you'd have the fast travel point too. So in that case, these were great. The larger outposts are standard fare, so I won't explain them again. Instead, we can see that there are some changes notably in stealth. Stealth in Primal is encouraged more because enemies can more easily overwhelm you. When most of your tools for combat are melee based, spacing is much harder, and brute enemies turn into entire mini-bosses, mostly. One of the ways stealth is encouraged in their case is that you can take them down with an upgrade in stealth. However, it's also important to consider the alarms, now horns that signal other people to join the fight, and there are enemies with horns on them, which created a much more interesting order of operations when tackling outposts. You now have to carefully consider who you can take out first, and the harder outposts make this even more complicated because enemies start wearing arrow-proof helmets, meaning you need to be in melee distance. This made stealth challenging, and of course not completely imbalanced by a silent sniper. Now, granted, an issue that crops up with this system is that now the stealth inconsistencies are laid bare, with abilities like chain takedowns being less desirable when it feels like half the time it doesn't work, or when you can be damaged and detected during said takedown. There's also the issue of one person spotting you and miraculously, instantly alerting the entire base, but I digress because stealth is still generally fun, and just as much as it is to go in spears blazing. A lot of where this fun comes from is the new beast taming system, which became a bit of a staple in the series going forward, with the companions making a return in every game going forward, and with the eagle scouting mechanic making its way into the Assassin's Creed games. Let's start with said scout, which is just fine. I think the owl controls are a little wonky, and when it came to actually surveying an area, it often was so high up that I struggled to see the enemies any better than if I just climbed the closest cliff and scouted the area myself. Scouting is made easier thanks to Hunter Vision, which is an ironic name given that the Eagle Vision probably would have fit here just fine. It highlights animal tracks, loot, enemies, nothing you haven't already seen. And fortunately, because enemies were easy to spot against the environment, especially the Azila, whose signature blue color scheme contrasts the green and orange landscapes, I wasn't feeling conditioned to spend the whole game in the desaturated lens, avoiding criticism some have levied against other games with systems like these. Alongside your owl, you can also have a companion join you, which can be tamed. Taming animals is easy, just throw some bait down, give them a good chin scratch, and voila, they'll die for you. But the fun comes from how effective they are. A bear will tear enemies to shreds, and if they get hungry, such as when losing health, they'll devour the person they just killed. The beasts reinforce the brutality of the era, and reinforce another caveman fantasy, which is storming into a fort, riding a bear, throwing spears at people. It's something you could never get from any other game. Animals can be ridden, and I like the way they function as vehicles. A mammoth is like a slow-moving tank, a bear is a good mix of power and speed, and the saber-tooth might as well be a Ferrari with how quickly it hustles through the woods. Different animals will offer buffs too, like marking nearby loot or objectives, which made tactically swapping between companions something worthwhile. In almost all Far Cry games, the quiet approach is what I take, but in Primal, I actually loved going in loud, and I think it's worth praising a game that can elicit that kind of change in me. I mentioned a lack of ranged weapons, which is true as you only have a bow and a slingshot, but I like that every melee weapon could be thrown too. It allowed me to make on-the-fly decisions while also fulfilling again this idea that during those times, you did what you could, and if someone was out of range and you had a club, fuck it. Toss it at them. But there is a slight issue with some of these admittedly fun features, and it's that, unfortunately, the things you do here are too familiar. Outposts are mostly the same fare, and it's why I, anecdotally, put the game down when I first played it a few years ago. I mentioned in other videos I didn't like Primal very much, and it's because I got bored after the first 4 hours. And that was because I immediately abandoned the main questline and farmed the outposts, like I had done in every game prior. But I now see that doing the outposts first is the best way to make the game an utter slog. Approaching these forts without all the tools at your disposal forces them to fall into a repetitive bore that is exacerbated by the fact that these outposts are already no different from previous games. I can now confidently say that I kinda liked Primal after giving it another chance, but I wish the side content here was better, because it has so much potential and it often isn't entirely capitalized on. We can start with the exception to this, which are the beast hunts. Throughout Oros, there are 4 legendary beasts you can hunt down, and these are all intended for the endgame, though I did them early through a little-known method called bashing my head against the wall for 3 hours, an appropriately primitive approach. These are all excellent, not just for the lore surrounding them, but the clear effort that goes into presenting these beasts as a threat. It follows a reasonable formula of hearing a rumor of the beast, arriving at their last known location, and seeing the absolute destruction they have caused to the surrounding structures and people. After following a blood trail, you'll find the animal in an enclosed arena, and be given the opportunity to take them down yourself. These hunts often have other people trying to take them down too, resulting in us seeing firsthand how lethal these animals are. And of course, we also see it happen to us as a mammoth shoves its horns so far up my ass that I'm tasting ivory. These hunts were a ton of fun, and aided by the inclusion of placing traps and the different challenges each animal provided kept things varied. I'll never forget the first time I thought I could cheese the cave bear by jumping in water, only to see him menacingly swimming towards me. They even have a neat system where if you fail the hunt, then the damage you've done to the animal carries over, which is especially helpful for the larger creatures like the mammoth, which will take a lot of damage before it can be executed. The mammoth is the only animal you outright kill, and I felt a little uncomfortable with it if I'm being honest. Primal is a rare instance where, through the sheer slowness of the kill, I felt guilty, as if this mammoth was minding its own business and then I entered its land and slaughtered him, the same as our antagonist had done to other people throughout the series. But it also made me reflect on the brutality of the life cycle. This is just how it is in the wilds. You hunt to survive until someone hunts you, and it's not pretty. Either way, it was an excellent portion of the game. Unlike the mammoth, our other prey can be tamed once their health is low enough. These legendary beasts are absolute powerhouses, especially the cave bear. The thing is just a tank. I tried not to use them too much, but it's hard not to because balance be damned, it is so much fun. The only hunt I wasn't a huge fan of was the 3 blood wolves, which we had to hunt individually. The first was a pain because it kept running away, causing tedium. The second and third were a pain because they hunt in packs, and there are a ton of wolves surrounding them. This made setting traps near pointless, because one of their lackeys would trigger them, causing me to essentially waste my resources on enemies that seemed to infinitely spawn. Aside from that, these were good, but it's all we get. Aside from these hunts, there are dynamic world events where we get to help the Ouija around Oros, but they never amounted to more than a basic excuse for combat, which is fine, and not unlike a lot of the Far Cry side content so far, but still disappointing, especially when it comes to excuses for combat and stealth, because the over 30 outposts and bonfires offer more than enough. More often, however, the main quests feel like side quests. In order to achieve the game's ending, you'll need to recruit and complete missions for different members of the Ouija tribe, but so many of them amount to fetch quests or any other basic excuse to go somewhere somewhere and fight other people or animals. When these are contrasted against the quests that see you on spiritual journeys, raiding entire villages, and engaging in some pretty okay boss fights, it all feels like the game is padding a little bit. Couple this with the ending itself being outright lame, and we get a gameplay loop full of ups and downs, and over-reliant on its core mechanics, which are just barely good enough to carry the game. Ultimately, I did enjoy Primal's gameplay, even when I was cleaning up some of the more menial tasks that were simply gathering materials, because the more you're forced into this dynamic open world, the more you can encounter dynamic events that will undoubtedly amuse you more than the task at hand. Clearing an outpost isn't a surprise, but seeing two people getting it on while scouting the place definitely did surprise me. A damn shame I had to introduce the most effective means of birth control, but there's fun in seeing something as unique as that. For the sake of clarity, however, there is still definitely a handful of great missions, both side and primary, that are worth mentioning. For example, any of the shaman missions are a ton of fun because they feel like an acknowledgement of the success of the previous drug trip missions in Far Cry 3 and 4. The visuals of these are a clear cut above the rest and are surprisingly abundant compared to the typical rations we got in the other games. If we want to look at some great side missions, then we could look at Urki the Thinker, who is this game's Herc. And while I didn't like Herc in the other games, man is Urki funny as hell. There's something so golden about delivering this prehistoric language with a perfect Southern American accent, and mixing this with the slapstick comedy Urki finds himself in, and we got some of the most fun missions in the game. In one mission, he wants to ward off animals from his cave, and to do so, he believes he needs a new stink. So this guy rubs literal shit all over his body, and still gets mauled by a bear. The best part is, no matter how hard Urki is knocked down, he just can't seem to die. Whether it's taking a spear to the face or failing a leap of faith, no matter what, he keeps groaning in pain. And in one case, I wondered what would happen if I threw him in a nearby pond. And in a hilarious turn of events, his groans were muffled due to him being under the water. What a hysterical detail to add. Urki is just one of the companions you can recruit to your village. He's what the game calls a specialist, someone who can, in exchange for a spot in the village, teach Takar new abilities and techniques. In order to receive their benefits, you need to build them a home, and this is the primary function of the base building mechanics, which I generally liked. It never took much time to get materials to upgrade the village. Often I got them while I was doing other things, and the game does conveniently notify you if you have enough materials for an upgrade, meaning I didn't have to keep track of what was needed. I do think, depending on what quests you do, you can accidentally backlog a lot of the base building for later, but I'm fine to consider that a me problem. Maybe this is a result of my monkey brain liking when numbers go big, but I wish Ubisoft games had more base building mechanics like we saw here, in Far Cry 4, Assassin's Creed 2, and even most recently in Shadows. I like having a place to decorate, and especially for a first-person game where cosmetics are limited to gloves and weapons, it's a good means for players to express themselves. Ultimately, despite the world being technically more barren, it remains, like most Ubisoft games, the highlight of your time. The visuals are insane, sound design is immersive, and the amount of dynamic events will always keep you laughing, even when it is admittedly jank. Sure, it's not exactly conducive to the story's serious tone to have a bear kill someone and then immediately eat their ass, and then have another character teabag them, but like, what the fuck, man? Show me any other game where you can get something like this. It's finally worth noting that even if the game doesn't completely reinvent the wheel, it's certainly not a long game, as my first playthrough only took about 13 hours, and that's with a considerable amount of farting around and doing most of the side activities. Unfortunately, the story is where a lot are going to be disappointed, as the game doesn't follow the same structure as previous Far Cry games, and that would be fine if the story was better. But if I had to guess, the setting offered too many restrictions for it to tell anything below surface level. Far Cry Primal tells a story not unlike other Far Cry games. Man enters an environment with nothing but a hatred for the oppressive forces that rule, and through both connections and strength, is able to topple the antagonists while engaging in some hypocrisy, seeing as their means of defense always mirrors the oppression levied against them in the first place. The difference with Primal is the lack of a strong villain, the lack of a player critique, and the lack of a satisfying ending. Let's begin by looking at the villains here, as we have both Ul and Battery, with Battery being a clearer poster girl for the game. So we can start with Ul, as it's likely who you'll defeat first. But before we do, let's look at how you arrived in Oros in the first place. Our protagonist is Takar, of the Winja people, and he's on a quest for Oros as he believes it houses the rest of his people. While making a pit stop to hunt a mammoth for food, he's separated from his group and forced to carry on alone. This opening tutorial is one of the best, because it immediately teaches us not just the mechanics of the game, but the rules of Oros, the most important of which being this: forget all your encounters with animals in the previous games. These guys don't fuck around. Dropping us into an enclosed area to hunt and gather safely is also great for getting the players introduced to the gameplay loop. Once making it to Oros, Takar encounters Scylla, a Ouija who has bad news. The Ouija are in Oros, but they're being run out of the place thanks to the Udam who are killing them. Our goal becomes clear, especially as the game operates on the assumption that you kinda know what you're doing by now. Rebuild the Ouija, stop the Udam, and with that, you're set off. As we grow our numbers and create a home for Scylla and our newfound shaman friend Tensei, we gain the ability to tame beasts and see what the Udam fear. Before we can get too hasty with tracking them down, their leader Ul shows up to intimidate the Ouija, foolishly leaving Takar alive. This is standard Far Cry, but a character like Ul, by the nature of being a Neanderthal, doesn't have the same impact as Pagan Min or Voss. This applies to most of the story, and it's always in an uncomfortable way because so many moments are presented the same as if they had a Voss-like character at the helm, but the aggression everyone exerts is so high that it's hard to see these people as anything more than sophisticated animals. This is why I mentioned the setting potentially inhibiting the story. And I don't intend to make excuses, rather, I want to at least acknowledge the constraints this setting inherently places on the narrative because I simply don't have any ideas on how to fix it. The story overall is fine, but a fine story off the backs of Far Cry 3 and 4, games with good stories, is a noticeable step down and can't be ignored. Even taking down Ul lacks the impact of other villains. Part of what made Pagan and Voss intimidating is that they weren't accessible. You need to work up to them. But this process is fast-tracked in Primal, as the only roadblock for Ul is being able to get past a poison gas that blocks the route to his lair. Sure, weather plays a factor, but it's very easy to craft winter clothing, and if you don't want to, you can easily light a torch on fire to keep you warm as you traverse the mountaintops. I did like the idea of having to adapt to your environment, but even entering Ul's lair is as simple as mowing down a few people, killing Ul, and that's it. The game does try to make us sympathize with him a little bit, as his dying request is that we take care of his children, but that doesn't amount to much when he was such a massive dick throughout the game. If anything, it reframes his actions in a worse way, like, why are you here killing Ouija across the map? Go raise your fucking kids, dude. Past this point, we're introduced to Battery and the Azila, a tribe that is actually being less aggressive to the Ouija. They are kidnapping them and sacrificing them in the name of a sun god, but are not outright invading their homes, so I don't see them as the same kind of threat. The leader of the Azila is Battery, a character with a great design, killer voice actor, and fine screen presence, but suffers from some of the same issues that Ul did, with the major difference being her intellectualism and faith. Ul felt like the pop culture depiction of cavemen, hardly smarter than the average bear smashing whatever's in their way. The Azila are the next step in our evolution, ones that kill with intention and believe in a higher power. Following in the footsteps of Far Cry 3, the supernatural elements in the game are here, but never leave reality. Due to the visions we see and the setting of our eventual confrontation with Battery, it's assumed that the god they serve is sort of real, but we don't know for sure how or why they believe sacrifices will prevent the apocalyptic event that they fear. Fortunately, this setup is paid off when we find a mask that is believed to have belonged to the Azila god and wear it while we burn their homes to the ground. Brutal, sure, but very cool at the same time. It's not all great though, as Battery's boss fight is incredibly disappointing, especially considering the lead up, which had excellent music, action, and the climax is this? I can't believe I'm saying this, but Battery's kind of a damage sponge. I tried looking this up and found a few forum posts saying the same thing, but I swear, it felt like I was missing something because Battery takes an entire arsenal to the head. Each arrow barely scratches her, and after some of her health is gone, she sends a few waves of Azila after us, I assume, to replenish our resources. It took forever, and generally wasn't fun. Battery can hit you with an arrow no matter how little of your head is peeking above cover, so there's a consistent loop of uncrouching to fire a shot, getting hit, and then entering cover to heal. It was hard, sure, but not in a very fun way that tested my skill, instead just testing my patience. Once Battery is killed, we return home with her bow and the Ouija celebrate. Oh, you wanted a conclusion? Haha, Primal isn't so generous, not unless you complete all of the Ouija specialist quests. This includes building and upgrading their homes, which was a bit of a grind, but as mentioned, could be a me issue. Once that's done, you get the ending, credits and all, and it just shows that the Ouija people now call Oros home and have nothing to fear. Everything's amazing and I don't know. All of this work just to see the game basically say, and everyone lived happily ever after, feels like a bit of a letdown. No doubt aided by the fact that most players won't see it until long after they kill both Ul and Battery. I think Primal's story would have fared better if the game offered one ending that seemed a little more open-ended, with a true ending being where the current one is. That way, people who do all the side content are rewarded, but those wanting to see some kind of conclusion aren't left behind. The ending and story as a whole also fail to answer the question of what happens after. Sure, Battery is killed, killed, but who's to say another Izila won't take her place? Battery herself isn't that much of a direct threat, she's more so the figurehead of the Izila people. Who's to say killing her changes nothing? Same with Ul and the Udam. These people still roam the map and still attack the Wenja on sight. We could have felt the impact of our work more if, say by the time we clear an outpost, we won't see enemies in that region anymore. This would line up with the gradual reclamation of Oros, and would show up in gameplay, because if we need materials, we would likely go to areas we know are safe for the Wenja. The story also doesn't, as mentioned, have the usual critique of the player that makes these games so fun to talk about. I should acknowledge that the Far Cry games never have deep critiques of the player, and are never going to incite deep philosophical or existential reflection, and I don't expect that from Primal. But Far Cry 3 looked at how easy it is for the player to become someone capable of effortlessly committing horrendous acts, and 4 looked at the hypocrisy that comes from such bloodshed, especially when said acts are being done in retaliation to the very same bloodshed from those above you. Primal has these same themes. In order to secure the Wenja's safety, Takar is willing to slaughter an entire population, and it's not like this is an unprompted retaliation, but I think the story could have improved if we had some kind of reflection from Takar, something to make him look at himself in the water's reflection and say, "Me bad guy?" In spite of this, there are still parallels with Primal and the other games, such as the personal growth as you conquer Oros. This personal journey to me was much more engaging than the story at the forefront, but at what point is that not enough? Fortunately, not totally at this point, because after everything, I still found myself having fun while going through the story, and the setting alone was enough to keep me entertained, which applies to Far Cry Primal as a whole, too. Looking to the future of Far Cry, we can see that Primal had a significant impact on the rest of the series. This was the first game to have a scouting mechanic that would crop up in Assassin's Creed, the first game to have 2 antagonists operating at the same time, and the first game to place a heavy emphasis on hunting, a system that otherwise was a footnote. Some have noted that the identity of the Far Cry series has been corroding with each entry, and I don't blame some people for claiming that that started here because it's technically true. However, I think this game still has enough of that DNA, and it is a spin-off, so I don't blame them for taking risks, especially when said risks are a large part of why this game was so well received and why it now has such a solid fan base. As mentioned, caveman games used to be a dime a dozen, but these days, we rarely ever see them, especially never from a quadruple A developer, and that's why so many enjoyed this game. Because with each passing year, this game gains more retrospective value, and this applies to the wider gaming market too. It's so rare that an established franchise takes a risk, because these days, one failed game is all it takes for a studio to be closed down. Hell, even successful games result in layoffs these days. Primal represents a time when companies were more likely to take risks, and when unique ideas were more likely to be funded. This is why, despite not loving Primal, and being unlikely to revisit it anytime soon, I'm happy it exists, because it fills a niche that deserves to be filled, and presents, despite its faults, a solid caveman game. Against the rest of the series, Primal indeed feels primitive. While stripping back its mechanics revealed how strong the core gameplay loop is, a lack of significant change to that loop and a heightened focus on hunting without any meaningful changes to animal AI also means that the lack of bells and whistles makes the blemishes clearer to see. The beast taming system is fun, and the new weapons showcase a newfound strength in Far Cry's close quarters combat. We also can't forget about the world. Oros is a beautiful place to be, and its beauty shines at all hours, all angles, and it genuinely might be one of the prettiest, most serene worlds in the company's history. The best part of this story is that Primal sold well. It reviewed decently and was overall a successful endeavor. I know this game is nearly a decade old, so a request like this means nothing now, but man, a Far Cry game set in medieval times during the Ice Age, or maybe something completely sci-fi like what we saw with Blood Dragon, every time Far Cry gets crazy, it turns out well. I suppose except for New Dawn, but hot take, I kind of like New Dawn. Maybe Primal is a lesson for the series, and for Ubisoft. When things get too bloated, too complicated, too ambitious, it might be better to look back at the past, at the sticks and stones fundamentals of the series they have, and see that each new entry doesn't need to be bigger and longer, but just different. To answer the question I posed at the beginning, no, I don't think Primal is underrated at all. The game was a financial success, critics were generally positive towards it, and so were fans. The only way it's remotely underrated is that many don't consider it one of the best, but I don't think that's grounds for something being underrated. Finally, something I noted when covering Spider-Man Web of Shadows and Assassin's Creed Rogue is that when most unanimously agree that a game is underrated, is it still underrated? My answer is no. Arkham Origins has been considered the most underrated Arkham game for so long that at what point is it not? Most people respect it and love it as much as the other games, and generally, it doesn't rank lower than games like Arkham Knight thanks to having no Batmobile segments. I think the same is true for Primal. So many agree that Primal is underrated that at this point, it isn't anymore. That doesn't mean we should stop enjoying it or talking about it, but that we don't need to label it underrated and give it this connotation that others don't like it. Instead, we can focus the discussion on how great of an idea this game was, and how cool it is to see people still talk about it. Primal is a weird game because I liked it, didn't love it, but liked it, and I love that it exists.